The morning of April 24th, 1964, in Newark Valley, New York, dawned spring-like, clear and cool. The air was clean, the earth warmed under the first rays of the sun, and work was in full swing in the fields. 24-year-old farmer Gary Wilcox, a practical and hard-working man, was completely absorbed in his task. He drove his trusty tractor across the vast field, nearly 100 hectares, about 250 acres, that he rented, methodically spreading fertilizer. The spring work season was in full swing, and every fair weather hour counted. The time was approaching 10 a.m. Gary was alone in this vast expanse, accompanied only by the roar of the tractor and the calls of passing birds. As he approached the far edge of the field, bordering a small wood, something unusual among the trees caught his attention. At first, it was just a strange gleam, unlike the glint of dew or a sunbeam. Gary, intrigued but not yet alarmed, turned his tractor and headed towards the edge of the woods to get a better look. Maybe someone had dumped an old barrel or some trash. Approaching closer, he stopped the tractor and shut off the engine. Now he could see the object clearly. His first thought was that it was a fuel tank that had fallen off some airplane. The object was oblong, egg-shaped, lying on its side, shining metallically in the sun. But as he got even closer, it became clear that this wasn't just abandoned junk. The egg wasn't lying on the ground, but was some distance above it, about half a meter, 1.5 feet, either resting on invisible supports or simply hovering in the air. The object was quite impressive, about 5 meters, 16 feet, long, roughly 4.5 meters, 15 feet, wide at its thickest part, and about 1.5 meters, 5 feet, high. Its surface was perfectly smooth, without a single seam, rivet, or porthole, as if cast from a single piece of metal resembling polished aluminum or stainless steel. No sound emanated from it. Gary, being a curious and not easily intimidated man, walked right up to the object. He circled it, examining it from all sides. Amazement wrestled with bewilderment. What was this thing? Whose was it? He reached out and poked the smooth surface with his finger. The metal felt cool to the touch, hard. He lightly kicked the object with his boot. No reaction. There was no vibration, no sound, no response whatsoever. It was like kicking a solid block of metal. It was strange and a bit eerie. He was about to head back to his tractor, deciding to report the find to the sheriff, when something completely unexpected happened. From beneath the lower part of the egg, where it hung over the ground, 2 figures emerged. They came out smoothly, without any noise, as if through an invisible door. These were not humans in the usual sense. They were small, just over a meter tall, about 4 feet. Their bodies were completely covered by suits that appeared seamless, without visible fastenings. The color of the suits was either dazzling white or silvery. The metal or fabric brightly reflected the sunlight. Not a single patch of skin, neither face nor hands, was visible. Their heads were covered by helmets or hoods that were part of the suits. Each of the beings held a small metal box, about 30 by 30 centimeters, 1 foot by 1 foot. The boxes were open at the top and filled with samples of what apparently interested them on Earth. Clumps of soil, grass roots, green leaves, twigs, and even a handful of the fertilizer Gary had just spread. They seemed to be collecting samples of flora and soil. Wilcox later recalled that in the first minute, he wasn't even particularly surprised or scared. His first thought was, is this a prank? Did the guys from the next farm decide to pull one on me, dressed up in some costumes? The appearance of the beings was so absurd and unexpected that it seemed more like a staged event than reality. But then one of the beings turned towards him. Although its face wasn't visible, Gary felt an intense gaze upon him. And then he heard a voice. Or rather, not exactly a voice. The being spoke, and the words formed directly in his head, similar to the Betty Andreas Son case, though Wilcox described it slightly differently. Don't be alarmed. We have spoken to people before, the thought phrase sounded. It sounded calm, almost monotonous. The voice wasn't like a voice. It's hard to explain, he recalled later in his report. I understood the words, understood what they were saying, but it wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. And I'm not sure it was English, though I understood everything. This was the moment Gary fully realized it wasn't a prank. His heart started pounding, but fear was still absent, replaced by immense, all-consuming curiosity and astonishment. He stood before two beings who were clearly not of this world, and they were talking to him. The strangers seemed to exhibit no hostility whatsoever. On the contrary, they showed keen interest in him and his work. They began asking him questions. What was he doing in this field? What was that big machine, the tractor? Why was he scattering this powder, fertilizer? What was fertilizer anyway, and what was it used for? The questions came one after another, spoken in the same strange, emotionless, mental voice. Gary, recovering from the initial shock, began to answer them. He explained in detail that it was a tractor, that he was a farmer, that he was fertilizing the land to make the corn grow better. He tried to explain the concept of agriculture, plant growth, nutrients in the soil. The beings listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Then the conversation took an even stranger turn. The beings informed him that they were organic entities from Mars. They claimed their home planet was a world of rocks where almost nothing grows, which was why they were so interested in studying life on Earth, especially the processes of growth and soil fertility. This statement seemed absurd to Gary. Mars, the red planet? But he didn't argue, simply continuing to answer their questions. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. For 2 hours, Gary Wilcox, a farmer from Newark Valley, stood in the middle of his field talking to two small beings in white suits who claimed to be from Mars. The entire time, he felt their intense, scrutinizing attention, as if they were scanning not only his words but his thoughts, his very being. He couldn't see their eyes behind the helmets, but he felt their gaze. At some point, growing bolder, Gary asked them a question. "Could you take me with you? Show me your world." But the beings politely but firmly declined. They explained that the atmosphere on their craft, and presumably on Mars, was too thin for a human. He simply wouldn't be able to breathe there. They also added that they tried to avoid densely populated areas on Earth and large cities. The reason was unexpected. Car exhaust and industrial emissions negatively affected the operation of their engines or navigation systems. Their craft functioned better in the clean air of the countryside. Gradually, while continuing the conversation, the beings approached Wilcox very closely, just a few meters away. They kept asking him about the details of his work, different types of fertilizers, crop rotation. Gary, fascinated by the opportunity to share his knowledge with someone so unusual, explained the basics of agronomy in detail. In a fit of hospitality, or simply wanting to do something useful for them, he offered, "I could run home and bring you a whole bag of fertilizer as a gift. You could study it better." But the aliens replied that it was time for them to go. They were in a hurry. They thanked him for the information, again, mentally, and headed back towards their egg-shaped craft. They disappeared beneath it just as smoothly and silently. The craft, which had been hovering quietly all this time, now emitting a barely audible low hum like a car engine idling, began to slowly glide parallel to the ground. It flew like this for about 50 meters, then abruptly gained altitude and speed and instantly shot off in a northerly direction, disappearing from view. Gary was left alone in the field, next to his tractor, trying to comprehend the incredibility of what had just happened. It was too real to be a dream or hallucination. The conversation, the questions, the answers, the small figures, their boxes of samples, the egg-shaped ship. He couldn't just forget his promise. Returning home for lunch, he grabbed an 80-pound, about 35-kilogram, bag of fertilizer, loaded it onto his tractor, and drove it back to the edge of the field, to the spot where he had met the aliens. He left the bag under a small tree, in plain sight. The next morning, when he arrived at the field, the first thing he did was check. The bag of fertilizer was gone. Whether his strange interlocutors or some locals had taken it remained unknown, but Gary wanted to believe his gift had reached its intended recipients. There was one more detail from their conversation that Gary remembered later, which added even more strangeness and credibility or mystification, depending on one's viewpoint, to the story. The little beings allegedly mentioned in passing that within the next year, two famous American astronauts, John Glenn and Virgil Gus Grissom, as well as two Soviet cosmonauts, would die. They also vaguely hinted at upcoming changes in the understanding of space. This prediction came true only partially and not exactly within the time frame, which is typical for such reports. John Glenn, contrary to the prediction, lived a long life and died only in 2016. However, Virgil Grissom did tragically die along with two other